I'm a firm believer that generally speaking, I don't think it's a particularly healthy way to live if we are constantly looking back over our shoulders and wondering, what if? Rehearsing various scenarios where life might have turned out differently, either positively or negatively, if only we'd made different choices or taken different courses of action. Generally speaking, what's in the past is precisely that. It's in the past. And there's little point in revisiting a series of hypotheticals. However, Psalm 124, which is where we are in our ponderings, teaches us that there is an appropriate time to look back and ask ourselves, what if? Because it makes us appreciate what God has done for us and how much worse things would have been without his aid and intervention. We know that Psalm 124 is a Psalm of David because we're told that. But we don't know precisely what situation he is referring to. What is clear is that as king, he is calling the nation to recall some great miraculous act of deliverance that came about, and for which the only explanation was God. Had God not done what he did, all would have been lost. The psalm is really in three very unequal sections, which I label in this way: verses 1 to 5, what if? Verses 6 to 7, but God. And verse 8, only God. But I want to take a slightly different approach and look at the wonderful imagery that David uses in the first 7 verses. He paints a series of very graphic and powerful word pictures to make his point. And it's worth just noting that this is where poetry has the advantage over straight narrative. One writer describes poetry as a kind of language that says more and says it more intensely than does ordinary language. And that is so true, isn't it? Compare, for example, the narrative record of the Exodus and the crossing of the Red Sea that we have in Exodus 13 and 14 with Moses' song, composed to celebrate the very same events recorded for us in Exodus 15. Or read the narrative account of Deborah's victory over the Canaanites that we have in Judges 4, and compare that with her song about the event that's recorded in the next chapter. Which account grabs the heartstrings more firmly? Which helps paint the picture more vividly? And so here David describes the danger the people were in and the deliverance God brought about. And he does so in poetic terms to help us picture them more clearly and so learn from them. Let's look at these images. In verse 3, they would have swallowed us up alive. The idea here is of their enemy being like a wild animal, utterly devouring its prey. It's like the picture Peter paints in his first letter when he describes Satan as he prowls around like a roaring lion, seeking someone to devour. Then in verse 4, the flood would have swept us away. We've seen pictures, haven't we, of towns and villages suddenly overwhelmed by fast rising floodwaters, with little, if any, time for escape, and sometimes nowhere to go. And sometimes we can feel as if we are about to be swept away by those who are against us or by the predicament that we find ourselves in. Jesus, at the end of the Sermon on the Mount, you will remember, speaks of the floods that batter the foundations of our very lives. And then in verse 4 and 5, he speaks about the torrent and the raging waters that would have gone over us. Now, this is clearly similar to the previous one, but I think is different in this respect. It has here the idea of suffocating as we drown in the sea of affliction. We would have been completely submerged and drowned, is the idea he makes here. And these verses made me recall that lovely promise of God through Isaiah in chapter 43. When you pass through the waters, I will be with you, and through the rivers, they shall not overwhelm you. That's the situation David has in mind as he reflects on the danger that he and his people found themselves in. And then we have in verse 6, we would have been like prey to their teeth. The idea of being chewed up and the very carcasses ground to dust by the fearsome teeth of the enemy. And then a lovely picture in verse 7, a bird caught unawares in a trap that's been laid by a hunter, and the bird is helpless and hopeless unless the snare is broken by an external force. Now, friends, David, as we have mentioned, clearly has in mind here some great national calamity that was imperiling the very existence of the nation of Israel. And if God had not miraculously intervened as he did, they would have been wiped off the map. And you and I may be able to recall situations in our lives when we were in great danger. And the only explanation for the fact that we survived and, as it were, lived to tell the tale, even physically, is that God intervened. And we can reflect, what if? What if God had not done so? But all of us who are the blood-bought children of God have been miraculously and wonderfully rescued from an enemy and a danger infinitely greater than anything David and his people face. We have been set free from Satan's clutches because we were plundered by one stronger than Satan, namely Jesus, who bound the strong man by his death on the cross. Like the bird in the snare, we were helpless to escape, without hope, in bondage to sin and death and hell. And then Christ came to our aid. And Christ made a public spectacle of Satan, triumphing over him in the cross. Just think, what if God had not chosen me and set his love upon me? What if Christ had not so loved me that he came and died in my place? It's truly unthinkable, isn't it? And then come those two wonderful words, but God. What if, but God.